right, so now we're moving on to the Huqoq Mosaic. Can you tell us how the Huqoq Mosaic was discovered?
Sure, because I'm the one who discovered it.
Yep. How did you find
um,
it?
right. So so this is a whole different. So now let's forget Masada. So one of and Josephus, by the way, one of my other fields of research interest is ancient synagogues, and by ancient synagogues, I mean basically Roman and late Roman periods. So we're talking first century up to 7th century, roughly, synagogues. And in sort of recent decades, I've become increasingly interested in the dating of certain types of ancient synagogue buildings. Most of the ancient synagogues that we have remains of, especially in Israel, most of the remains of synagogues we have are in Israel, although there are also remains of ancient synagogues outside of Israel. But the overwhelming majority of the remains of synagogue buildings that we have date to a period that we call late antiquity, or you could call it the late Roman period. So we're talking 4th, 5th, 6th centuries CE. And this is interesting because this is exactly the period of the rise of Christianity, right? This is the period when Christianity becomes the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire, and large parts of the population begin to convert to Christianity, and the Jews living in the land of Israel come under Christian rule, right? Later Roman Christian rule. And the reason I became interested in the chronology of synagogues is because some of these synagogue buildings from this period are very large and are quite richly decorated. And this fact that we have these large, richly decorated synagogue buildings from this period contradicts, or at least would seem to contradict, a view that is quite common among many of my Israeli colleagues nowadays, that Jewish settlement in this period declined, and that Christian rule was oppressive to the Jews, because if the Jews are able to afford and build large congregational buildings for prayer and worship, right, that would contradict that view. And so there's a whole nother kind of background to all of this, but basically I started in 2011 excavating at this ancient Jewish village in Galilee called Huqoq. It's located a couple of miles inland from Capernaum and Migdal. So Capernaum, the base of Jesus' Galilean ministry, Migdal, ancient Magdala, the hometown of Mary Magdalene. It's located just a couple of miles inland. And it was a Jewish village in the Roman and late Roman periods, so the periods that we're talking about. It had never been excavated before, but it had been surveyed, so other archaeologists had walked around and looked at the remains visible on the surface of the ground without excavating. And there were indications that there was a monumental synagogue building here, even though, again, we didn't know for sure, and it had never been excavated. So I started my excavations in 2011 in the hopes of finding remains of a certain type of monumental synagogue building dating to the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, with the hopes, again, of kind of addressing the larger historical issues raised by the existence of synagogues like this against the background of, Christian rule. And we were very fortunate in already in the very first season of excavation to come down on the east wall of the synagogue, a little part of it. And basically after that came back every summer and continued excavating more and more. We did not expect to find a synagogue with mosaic floors. Generally speaking, the type of synagogue that we have, it's called a Galilean type of synagogue. If any of your listeners have ever been to Capernaum, for example, they've seen a synagogue of this type there. Generally speaking, this kind of synagogue building has flagstone pavement in the building, not mosaics. So we were not expecting to find mosaics. But what happened is that in the second season in 2012, when we reached the level of the floor, sure enough, we came down on a patch of mosaic floor. And every summer after that, except for the 2 COVID years when we didn't dig, but every summer after that, we were able to uncover more and more of the mosaics. And this past summer, 2023, We finally finished the whole synagogue. We got all the mosaics. And that's why now actually I'm not going to continue with the excavation. We're stopping here because now we have to work on publication. The most important part of archaeology is not excavation, it's publication. It's making the results of what you discovered accessible to everybody else, right? That's the goal. I say it's like, again, if we compare it to a science, right? Archaeology, the experiment, when you conduct the experiment in archaeology, that's the excavation. But unlike in the exact sciences, the hard sciences, where the goal is to replicate the experiment, in archaeology, you can't replicate the experiment because you've destroyed the evidence as you've dug it out of the ground. And therefore, all of the data are gone. And we now have to publish everything that we destroyed in the process of digging it up. So now, after 11 seasons of excavation, we are, and having completed the excavation of the synagogue and the exposure of all the mosaics, I'm stopping, and my team and I will be spending the next X number of years working on preparing the final excavation report and making those exciting discoveries accessible to everybody else.
What does the Huqoq mosaic depict exactly?
Yeah, so the mosaics are divided into panels that depict, for the most part, different biblical stories. And when I say biblical, I mean from the Hebrew Bible, or what some of your listeners might call the Old Testament. So we have, for example, scenes of Samson and the parting of the Red Sea and Noah's Ark and the building of the Tower of Babel. So we have scenes from the book of Daniel. We have just a whole bunch of different biblical stories and scenes depicted in our mosaics, plus one exceptional mosaic, which we call the elephant mosaic, that is not a biblical story. It may be, I think, what I think it is the legendary meeting between Alexander the Great and the Jewish high priest. Everybody has their own opinions about what that mosaic depicts, but so we have this one exceptional panel. And in the middle of the hall, there is a particular kind of motif called a Helios zodiac cycle, which depicts the sun god Helios in the center, surrounded by the signs of the zodiac and then the four seasons. And that actually is a motif that's found in 10 synagogues now. We have 10 ancient synagogues in Israel that have a Helios zodiac cycle, although ours differs in some details from the others, but that's not unique to our synagogue. So we have just a wealth of biblical stories, far more than have ever been discovered in any other ancient synagogue in the land of Israel, for sure. The only really comparable discovery in any way is a synagogue in Syria that's located today in Syria at a place called Dura Europos, which was discovered and excavated back in the 1930s, where the walls were painted with bands, registers that depict biblical stories. There is a little bit of overlap in some of the stories. So they have, for example, a parting of the Red Sea. We have the Red Sea, but the style is very different, and the content, the way it's depicted, is very different. And most of the scenes that we have are not in the Dora Europos synagogue, or for that matter, in pretty much any other synagogue that's been discovered in Israel until now.
So what on the elephant mosaic tells you that it's probably Alexander the Great? Can you tell us what led to your conclusion?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, by the way. Okay, so first let me describe, by the way, so in case your listeners are interested, we've published a lot of the mosaics already in preliminary form in different kinds of publications. And if your listeners go to the DIG website, which is simply huqoq.org, and you can probably put a link in huqoq.org, there's a tab and it says reports. And the reports have all of the, links to all of our publications, and your listeners can go there to see pictures of the mosaics, right? Photos of the mosaics. Also, National Geographic has provided some of our funding for the excavation, and they have a publication of the elephant mosaic online, where it's a fantastic thing. You can zoom in to like look at details and stuff like that. So that's also worth looking at. So I'll describe very briefly what you see, but it's easier if you actually go online and then take a look at what I'm talking about. So it's divided into 3 horizontal strips or registers that get bigger as you go towards the top. So the bottom register, the bottom strip is smallest, and then you have a medium center one and then a big one at the top. And the bottommost register seems to show the aftermath of a battle. There's a dead elephant with a dead soldier riding the elephant. There's a dead bull pierced by spears and gushing blood. There's a pile of military equipment. So it looks like the aftermath of a battle. Although I will say, by the way, that having a dead bull in a battle is a little weird. The middle register shows an arcade, a series of arches. On top of each arch is a lighted oil lamp, and in each arch is a male figure, an individual male figure. So each arch frames a male figure. All of the male figures, except for the one in the middle, are young, beardless or clean-shaven men who are dressed in very elaborate garments, which show that they're elite men, and they're holding in their hands sheathed swords. And they are looking inwards to the guy in the middle who's bigger than the others. He's also the only one who's seated. He's literally enthroned. He's elderly, bearded, and white-haired. And he's holding in his hands what looks like a rolled-up scroll. And then in the uppermost, the biggest register, you have a meeting in the center between 2 large male figures. One is that same bearded, white-haired figure that you see in the middle register. The other is a bearded male figure, not elderly, dressed in very elaborate military attire, very elaborate sort of military outfit, but also with the attributes of a Greek king. He's got a corded diadem around his head, and he's wearing a purple cloak. And he is holding with one hand the horns of a very large bull. And behind the bull is a row of soldiers with overlapping shields that I think is intended to represent a Greek military formation called a phalanx. And then to the right of the bull and below the phalanx, one above the other, are two elephants with shields tied to their sides, meaning they're battle elephants. And so we have a constellation of images here that suggest that military royal figure is a Greek king. And apparently a Greek king, either Alexander the Great or one of his Greek successors. And that goes with the elephants and everything else. And the other figure, the bearded, elderly, white-haired figure, is accompanied on his side by a group of young, beardless, or clean-shaven men who are sheathing their swords as you go in towards the center of the action, and who are the same young men in the center register. And so this panel is apparently telling a story, a narrative, that is meant to be read from the bottom up, right? So and by the way, there are people who have argued that you should read it from the top down, and there's really no way to prove that that's not the case, but my Mosaic specialist who published this, Karen Britt and Boustan, and you'll find their publication again online. They argue, and I agree with them on this, that the narrative is meant to be read from the bottom up, that the story starts at the bottom and culminates at the top with the meeting between these 2 large male figures in the center. That's kind of the culmination of the story. And the question then is, again, which story is it? So Karen and Ranan published this Mosaic as a book in 2018. And in their book, they explored the various possible interpretations of what this story is. The fact that you have battle elephants indicates that it's apparently not a story from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, because there are no stories in the Hebrew Bible that involve battle elephants. So then it means, it could be anything. If it's not a story from the Hebrew Bible, then it could be just about anything, right? And there are no inscriptions accompanying the figures in the panel to tell us who they are. So since Karen and Raanan published their interpretation, I know of at least 10 other articles, at least 10 that have been published suggesting other interpretations. The most likely interpretations we could group into Maccabean, meaning that somehow this is a story connected with the Maccabees, the ones who led that revolt. Karen and Raanan think that it's a story connected with Hasmonean history, the successors of the Maccabees. And I again think, and I know I'm not the only one, even though I haven't really written about this, that it's Alexander the Great and the Jewish high priest. So, okay, so why do I think that? So, without inscriptions accompanying this panel, right, to identify who the figures are, and we're talking now about a synagogue that dates to around the year 400 CE in rural Galilee, in a village in Galilee, apparently pretty big and prosperous village. We didn't realize that, but it probably was, apparently, judging from the size and decoration of the synagogue. But anyway, it was a village. It wasn't a city, wasn't an urban center, it wasn't a town. Huqoq was a village. So you have to assume that without inscriptions, that any Jew who walked into that synagogue at that point, that story would have been so obvious to them that they would have automatically known what it was, right? And the one individual in history who is so famous that he's automatically identifiable and whose stories about him continued to circulate through late antiquity was Alexander the Great. Of course, there were stories about the Maccabees. And of course, there were stories about the Hasmoneans. But there were many different, many different stories. There's first Maccabees, second Maccabees, third Maccabees, probably other stories about the Maccabees. They were all circulating. Lots of stories about the Hasmoneans. Once you reject the possibility that it's Alexander, the problem is it could be anybody. And the way that I think about it is it had to be so obvious to whoever entered that synagogue, who that figure was. It has to be the most obvious person possible. And the only person who fits that bill is Alexander. And by the way, so what happens is we know that stories about the legendary meeting between Alexander the Great and the Jewish high priest circulated in this period among the Jewish population. This was a very famous story. There were different variations of it that circulated. The story goes that as Alexander came through the country with his conquests in 332 BC, that the Jews heard that he's on his way. This is all legendary. This didn't happen, right? But the story goes, the Jews heard that Alexander's coming through and they get all like, whoa, Alexander's coming. What are we going to do? And so the high priest and then the other priests of the city or the nobles dress up in their best white outfits and they go out to greet Alexander. And Alexander, when he sees the high priest, he's so awed by his appearance and by the power of the God of Israel that he actually bows down before the high priest. The point of the story, of course, is to show that the God of Israel was so powerful that even the greatest king of all time, Alexander the Great, recognized his power and bowed down before the Jewish high priest. Right? That's the point of the story. It's completely legendary. This is a story that was invented by Jews after the time of Alexander, because at the time of Alexander, nobody knew who Alexander was. It wasn't only in retrospect, right? Does he become Alexander the Great, right? With this famous name and everything. And after his time, everybody then seeks to connect themselves to Alexander and his fame. And by the way, going back to Herodium, one of the things that I think is so interesting about Herod's mausoleum at Herodium is that it's clear that Alexander modeled his mausoleum at Herodium, among other things, on the Philippian at in Olympia in Greece, which was built by Philip II, the father of Alexander, and contained a statue of, among other things, Alexander. In other words, Herod, just like everybody else in his time, was linking himself to Alexander. Everybody after the time of Alexander the Great wanted to link themselves to Alexander. He's the greatest king of all. And we know that the story, this legend of Alexander meeting the Jewish high priest, circulated in different versions among the Jewish population. Josephus has a version of it, but there's also a version in rabbinic literature. There are other versions that circulated right through this period. And so one of the problems that I have with the Hasmonean interpretation, by the way, is that it's, in my mind, a kind of an obscure episode and actually a little bit scholarly. Like, I mean, actually, I had to kind of go and look up the story to figure out what exactly, this was. Nobody needed explanation about Alexander the Great. This was a story that everybody knew. Everybody knew who Alexander was. He's the only figure who everybody walking into that synagogue would have looked and said, that has to be the greatest Greek king of all. That has to be Alexander meeting the Jewish high priest. That's why I think that's what it is. It's the only thing that makes sense of the context and the evidence that we have. But again, that's my opinion. One of these days, maybe I'll write it up. I actually have never written it up. And one of the reasons is Karen and Ron Nunn did a pretty good job of exploring that possibility in their book. And the second reason is because actually, mosaics weren't my goal in excavating Huqoq. My goal was to try to date these kind of synagogue buildings and kind of figure out, again, the sort of historical picture of what's going on with Jewish settlement against the background of, Christian rule. And I'm not an art historian, and I'm happy to say what I think, but I'm not sure I'm all that motivated to sit down and really, as opposed to investing my time in research and other things that are more central to my own ongoing research program. But it's a fun topic, right?
Yep. Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Jodi Magness.
Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.